I have spent 3 decades in uniform studying how power truly operates when it is stripped of ceremony, stripped of political messaging, and reduced to its most basic form, force, meaning force in a contested environment. What I am about to describe is not how power is presented in official statements or polished defense briefings, but how it behaves when assumptions of stability collide with the reality of modern warfare. What unfolded over the last 72 hours in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf, according to the emerging operational picture, represents the most significant shift in regional military balance I have witnessed in my entire career. That includes the end of Soviet influence, the Gulf War, the invasion of Iraq, and every strategic misjudgment that followed in the decades after. The central development, as reported through multiple military channels, is the transfer of a large number of DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missiles from China to Iran. This transfer was not formally announced or diplomatically acknowledged. Instead, it became visible through action when Iranian coastal and naval forces reportedly deployed these systems in an engagement against an Israeli naval task force operating in the Eastern Mediterranean. Within a matter of hours, that naval force was effectively destroyed. The reports described the loss of multiple corvettes, submarines, the flagship of the formation, and a number of support vessels. The speed and completeness of the outcome have raised serious questions about both capability and preparedness on all sides involved. To understand why this matters, it is important to recognize what the Israeli Navy represented before this event. For decades, it has been a core instrument of regional power projection, operating across multiple maritime theaters with confidence backed by advanced systems and long-standing strategic partnerships. That structure, according to the current assessments, has now suffered a catastrophic operational collapse. What makes this development even more significant is not just the destruction itself, but the method by which it was achieved. Rather than a traditional naval engagement, the outcome was reportedly determined by land-based missile systems launched from coastal positions. These are not conventional naval weapons in the traditional sense, but long-range ballistic systems designed specifically to target moving ships at sea. The DF-21D system, developed over decades, was originally intended to challenge the ability of large naval formations, particularly carrier groups, to operate freely in contested waters. Its appearance in this conflict represents a shift from theoretical deterrence to practical deployment. At the same time, American carrier groups operating in the broader theater did not move toward the area of engagement. Instead, they repositioned away from it. In military terms, movement is never neutral. When the most powerful naval assets in the world choose distance over proximity during a crisis, that decision itself becomes a strategic signal. In the next section, I will break down the operational sequence in more detail, how the engagement unfolded, how the missile systems were reportedly deployed, and why the defensive systems on the Israeli side were unable to prevent the outcome that followed. To understand the sequence of events that followed, we have to reconstruct the operational timeline as clearly as possible based on available military reporting and satellite tracking data. What emerges is not a chaotic battlefield exchange, but a tightly compressed engagement window, in which one side appears to have acted with coordination and speed that left very little room for response. The Israeli Naval Task Force had reportedly been operating in the Eastern Mediterranean for several weeks prior to the strike. Its mission combined maritime interdiction primarily aimed at disrupting weapons movement through regional waterways and broader deterrence operations intended to maintain naval presence along critical sea lanes. The formation itself was substantial. It included multiple modern corvettes, submarines that had temporarily surfaced for resupply and rotation, and a supporting logistical fleet responsible for fuel, maintenance, and operational sustainment. On paper, this was not a lightly defended group. It represented one of the more capable naval assemblies in the region. Among its key assets were advanced surface combatants equipped with modern radar systems and layered defensive capabilities, including ship-based missile defense designed to intercept incoming aerial threats. The submarines within the group added a further dimension of undersea deterrence, typically considered one of the most survivable and strategically valuable elements in any navy. However, the critical vulnerability in this situation appears to have been timing and the nature of the incoming threat. According to the reconstruction of events, the DF-21D missile launches were detected by satellite systems within minutes of their deployment from mobile launch platforms along Iranian coastal positions. But detection did not translate into meaningful response time. The missiles were already in their terminal trajectory phase by the time alerts reached operational commanders. At hypersonic speeds, the engagement window shrinks to seconds. Even advanced detection systems cannot fully compensate for the physics of such velocity. Defensive systems aboard the Israeli vessels activated immediately, entering full interception mode. Some incoming threats were reportedly engaged successfully, particularly slower or less maneuverable elements of the strike package. But the core of the attack, the ballistic reentry vehicles designed to maneuver during their final descent, presented a different problem entirely. These were not conventional missiles following predictable arcs. They were guided systems capable of adjusting their trajectory in the final phase of flight, making interception significantly more complex. Within the first hour of engagement, the situation escalated rapidly. Impacts began occurring across the task force area in a sustained sequence rather than a single concentrated strike. The flagship was reportedly among the earliest major losses, followed by additional high-value combat vessels, including submarines that were exposed during surface operations. The timing of those submarine losses is particularly significant. Submarines are generally least vulnerable when submerged, but when surfaced, especially in a coordinated group, they lose that advantage entirely. In this case, their exposure coincided with the peak of the incoming strike window. Over the next several hours, the remaining vessels within the task force were progressively engaged. Support ships, which lacked the defensive redundancy of frontline combat vessels, were among the last to be struck, but were not spared from the overall outcome. By the end of the engagement window, the task force had ceased to function as an organized naval formation. What remains especially notable in this sequence is the apparent precision of target allocation. Rather than a broad area saturation approach, the strike pattern suggests structured targeting priorities. High-value vessels appear to have been engaged first, followed by sequential neutralization of remaining combat and support elements. This level of coordination implies more than just missile capability. It suggests an integrated targeting system capable of tracking, prioritizing, and assigning individual missiles to specific moving targets under real-time conditions. That is a critical distinction because it elevates the system from a blunt weapon to a coordinated strike architecture. By the time the engagement concluded, recovery operations were already underway, but the scale of losses had effectively removed the task force as an operational entity. What followed was not just a battlefield outcome, but a strategic shock, one that immediately raised questions about naval survivability in contested missile environments. In the next section, we will examine the nature of the DF-21D system itself, why it is so difficult to counter with existing naval defenses, and why its deployment fundamentally changes the risk profile for surface fleets operating in modern conflict zones. To understand why this engagement produced such a decisive outcome, you have to understand the weapon system at the center of it. The DF-21D is not just another missile in a modern arsenal. It represents an entirely different category of threat, one that was designed from the ground up to solve a very specific strategic problem: how to make large surface naval formations vulnerable at long range. This system belongs to what military planners refer to as anti-ship ballistic missiles. Unlike cruise missiles, which fly at lower altitudes and can be tracked along relatively predictable paths, these weapons follow a ballistic trajectory into the upper atmosphere before descending at extremely high speeds toward their target. In the terminal phase, they transition from predictable flight to active maneuvering, which is where the real challenge begins for any defensive system. The core difficulty is time. A modern warship, even when operating at maximum alert status, has only seconds to detect, classify, track, and attempt interception once a hypersonic reentry vehicle enters its final approach. At those speeds, the margin for error is effectively zero. The DF-21D compounds this problem By incorporating a terminal guidance system that combines multiple sensor inputs, radar-based tracking is supplemented by infrared detection, allowing the missile to adjust its path even if electronic countermeasures are deployed. This redundancy is specifically designed to reduce the effectiveness of jamming and deception techniques that modern navies rely on. More importantly, the re-entry vehicle is not fixed to a straight descent. It is capable of lateral maneuvering during the final phase of flight. That means traditional predictive interception models, where defenders calculate where a missile will be based on its current trajectory, become significantly less reliable. The target is no longer moving in a straight line. It is actively shifting in ways that are difficult to anticipate in real time. This is where existing naval defense systems begin to show structural limits. Systems like the SM-3, designed primarily for ballistic missile defense in broader strategic contexts, have demonstrated success under controlled test conditions. But controlled environments do not replicate the complexity of a real naval battle, where electronic warfare, multiple simultaneous threats, and high-speed maneuvering targets all occur at once. In theory, layered defense systems on modern warships are designed to handle saturation attacks. They combine long-range interceptors, medium-range missile defense, and close-in weapon systems intended as a final protective barrier. In practice, however, each layer depends on timing, detection, accuracy, and uninterrupted sensor data, all of which become increasingly strained under hypersonic engagement conditions. What makes the DF-21D particularly significant is that it was not designed as a general-purpose weapon. It was engineered specifically to deny access to large naval formations in contested waters. In strategic terms, its purpose is not just destruction, but exclusion, preventing an adversary from operating freely in a given maritime zone. When systems like this are deployed effectively, they force a change in behavior before they even fire a shot. Naval planners must account for the possibility of engagement at distances that were previously considered safe. This alters routing, positioning, and even the willingness to enter certain theaters altogether. In the case of the recent engagement, reports suggest that defensive systems on the Israeli vessels did activate and did achieve partial success against certain incoming elements. However, the most advanced components of the strike package, those designed for terminal maneuver and high-value targeting, appear to have overwhelmed those defenses. It is important to be precise here. This does not mean that naval defense systems are obsolete. It means that the margin of superiority that surface fleets have historically relied on is narrowing significantly when facing this category of threat. That distinction matters because it shifts the conversation from absolute vulnerability to conditional risk. At the same time, the presence of such systems in Iranian hands represents a major expansion of regional capability, a technology originally developed over decades for a specific strategic theater has now been introduced into a completely different operational environment. That transfer alone changes planning assumptions for every naval force operating in the region. As we move forward, the key question is not just what the DF-21D can do in isolation, but how its deployment changes the broader calculus of naval power projection. Because once a weapon system can reliably deny access to entire regions of water space, it does not just influence battles, it reshapes strategy itself. In the next section, we will examine the American response, or more precisely, the lack of forward deployment by carrier strike groups and what that absence signals about current strategic confidence and deterrence credibility in the region. If you want to understand the strategic meaning of what just happened, you cannot look only at the missiles or the destroyed ships. You also have to look at what did not happen afterwards, specifically the movement of American carrier strike groups in response to a rapidly escalating crisis in a region where they have historically been the central instrument of power projection. The USS Harry S. Truman and the USS George H.W. Bush were both operating within the broader Mediterranean and adjacent theaters during the unfolding situation. In previous decades, a crisis involving a major Allied naval force would almost automatically trigger a visible repositioning of American carriers toward the area of engagement. That movement would serve both a military and political function, reinforcing deterrence, reassuring allies, and signaling readiness to escalate if necessary. In this case, that movement did not occur. Instead, the carriers reportedly adjusted their positions away from the most sensitive operational zone, maintaining distance from the Eastern Mediterranean engagement envelope. This detail is not secondary. It is central. Carrier strike groups are not just military tools. They are strategic messages. For decades, their presence has functioned as a form of mobile credibility, an implicit guarantee that the United States can project overwhelming force into any contested region if required. Their forward deployment is often interpreted as more important than actual combat use because it represents the threshold of commitment. When carriers move closer to a crisis, it signals escalation readiness. When they remain at distance during a major regional shock, it signals caution, uncertainty, or risk recalculation. In this situation, the most widely cited reason for that distance is the presence of DF-21D systems within Iranian operational range. From a purely military perspective, the logic is straightforward. Carrier strike groups are among the most valuable and complex military assets ever deployed. Each one carries thousands of personnel and represents decades of investment in training, logistics, and technology. If there is no reliable defensive solution against a known anti-ship ballistic missile threat, then advancing into that engagement zone introduces a level of risk that cannot be easily justified even under crisis conditions. In that sense, the decision to remain outside the engagement envelope is consistent with force protection principles. But strategic behavior is not judged only by what is defensible. It is judged by what is perceived. For allies in the region, the absence of forward carrier movement introduces ambiguity into what was previously considered a stable security framework. For adversaries, it introduces opportunity. And for neutral states observing the situation, it forces a recalculation of how credible external guarantees actually are when tested under high-risk conditions. The implications extend beyond this single event. American extended deterrence has long relied on the assumption that forward deployed forces would always be available to stabilize crises in real time. When that assumption is tested and the response is delayed or constrained, the deterrent effect itself begins to shift. It is important to emphasize that this does not mean the United States has lost military capability. It has not. The United States Navy remains the most advanced maritime force in the world. But capability and freedom of action are not the same thing. A force that exists but cannot safely be positioned where it is strategically needed is a force operating under constraint. That distinction is now visible to every government in the region. Official statements from Washington have continued to emphasize commitment and readiness, but they have avoided any explicit operational commitments that would require immediate repositioning of carrier assets into high-risk zones. This is a careful balancing act, maintaining diplomatic assurance while avoiding escalation into a domain where vulnerability has already been demonstrated. Meanwhile, adversaries are observing a different signal entirely. They are not reacting to statements, they are reacting to movement or the lack of it. In strategic terms, absence can communicate as clearly as presence. And in this case, the absence of forward deployment is being interpreted through the lens of recent events. A destroyed naval formation, a demonstrated missile capability, and a confirmed engagement envelope that extends across key maritime corridors. This combination forces a re-evaluation of risk thresholds. It also introduces a new variable into regional planning, the possibility that certain zones of water space are no longer freely accessible to carrier-based operations under conditions of active opposition. That is a significant shift because it affects not just one crisis, but the entire structure of deterrence in the region. If carriers cannot be confidently moved into contested waters, then the entire architecture of rapid response begins to change. In the next section, we will examine the broader geopolitical implications of this shift, how China's transfer decision, Iran's operational execution, and a regional response together point toward a restructuring of power that extends far beyond a single engagement. To understand the deeper meaning of this moment, you have to move beyond the battlefield outcome and examine the strategic intent behind the systems that were deployed. What we are seeing is not just a regional escalation, but the convergence of long-term planning by multiple state actors whose goals have been building for years. The transfer of DF-21D systems to Iran, as described in the available reporting, is not a short-term decision. It reflects a strategic calculation by China about the changing structure of global power. Beijing is not acting as a passive supplier of weapons, but as an actor shaping regional balance through carefully selected capabilities that alter access and denial dynamics. From a strategic perspective, this type of transfer does not happen in isolation. It requires confidence in supply chain security, confidence in operational integration, and confidence in the political cost-benefit balance of provoking a reaction from other major powers. The fact that such a transfer reportedly occurred anyway suggests that the perceived strategic advantages outweighed the risks. Iran's role in this structure is equally important. For decades, Iran has pursued a doctrine centered on strategic autonomy, particularly in the face of overwhelming external pressure. That doctrine has consistently emphasized survivability, denial capability, and asymmetric response options rather than conventional parity with larger military powers. The integration of a system like the DF-21D into that doctrine represents a major expansion of capability. It shifts Iran's position from a primarily regional deterrent posture to one that can influence naval movement across a much broader maritime space. In practical terms, this means that naval planners operating in adjacent waters must now account for a far more complex threat environment than before. What makes this combination significant is not just the hardware itself, but the alignment between technology and intent. Military capability alone does not determine outcomes. It becomes decisive when it is paired with a clear operational doctrine and the willingness to absorb the consequences of its use. In this case, the reported engagement against the Israeli Naval Task Force demonstrates that alignment in practice. The system was not simply present, it was integrated, activated, and used in a coordinated manner that suggests preparation and planning rather than improvisation. At the same time, Israel's loss of a major naval formation represents more than a tactical defeat. It affects the broader structure of deterrence that has supported its regional military posture. Naval forces are not just instruments of direct combat. They are also tools of signaling, blockade enforcement, and strategic reach. When that layer is removed, the overall flexibility of a military system is reduced. This does not eliminate Israel's military capability, but it changes its composition. Air and land-based systems remain intact, but maritime options are significantly constrained, at least in the near term. Rebuilding that capacity is not just a matter of replacing vessels. It requires time, training, and restoration of operational confidence. On the American side, the situation introduces a different kind of pressure. The United States now faces a gap between formal commitments and practical risk tolerance. It maintains alliance structures and security guarantees, but it is also operating in an environment where direct naval intervention carries a higher level of uncertainty than before. That gap is where perception begins to matter as much as capability. In international relations, credibility is not determined solely by what a state can do, but by what others believe it is willing to do under specific conditions. Once that belief shifts, even temporarily, it influences behavior across the entire system. This is why reactions from other global actors are so important. Russia, for example, is not directly involved in this engagement, but it is closely observing the redistribution of American attention and resources. Every crisis that requires American strategic focus in one theater reduces its flexibility in others. That dynamic has been a consistent feature of great power competition for decades. Similarly, countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America are watching these developments not as isolated events, but as data points in a larger calculation about the reliability of external security commitments. When a system that has defined regional order for decades begins to show constraints, even temporarily, those observations influence long-term alignment decisions. What is emerging is not a single new power structure, but a more fragmented and conditional one. Influence is becoming more distributed, and access to contested regions is becoming more dependent on specific capabilities rather than general superiority. The DF-21D transfer, the naval engagement, and the repositioning of American carriers all fit into this broader pattern. Each reflects a different layer of the same structural shift, the movement away from uncontested maritime dominance toward contested, denial-based environments. In the final section, we will look at what this means for the future. Not in terms of prediction, but in terms of structural constraints, what options remain available to the major actors involved, and what kinds of decisions will determine whether this shift stabilizes or escalates further. At this point, the central question is no longer what happened, but what kind of system the world is now entering as a result of these events. When you step back from the individual engagement and look at the pattern forming across multiple actors, a clearer structure begins to emerge, one defined less by dominance and more by constraint, overlap, and competing zones of denial. The destruction of a major naval formation, the reported deployment of advanced anti-ship ballistic missiles, and the absence of forward American carrier movement are not isolated developments. Together, they indicate a shift in how maritime power is projected and how it is contested. For decades, naval superiority was measured by the ability to enter any ocean region and operate freely. That assumption is now being tested in real operational conditions. Iran's emergence as a platform for advanced long-range maritime denial capability changes the geometry of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf, and surrounding waterways. It introduces a layer of risk that cannot be easily neutralized by traditional fleet concentration or numerical superiority. Instead, it forces dispersal, distance, and constant recalculation of engagement thresholds. China's role in this shift is equally structural. By extending advanced systems beyond its immediate theater and into partner states, it effectively exports a strategic concept that control of sea space no longer depends on fleets alone, but on the ability to threaten those fleets from land-based positions at range. This is not just a transfer of hardware. It is a transfer of doctrine. For the United States, the challenge is more complex. Its global military posture was built on the assumption of forward deployability, especially through carrier strike groups that could rapidly enter contested zones and stabilize crises through visible presence. When that ability becomes conditional, even temporarily, the signaling function of those deployments changes. This does not mean American power has disappeared. It remains vast in scale, technologically advanced, and globally distributed. But power is not only about possession, it is about usable access under real-world threat conditions. And that is where the current shift is most visible. Israel, meanwhile, faces a different type of recalibration. Its military system remains multi-layered and highly capable in air and land domains, but the loss of a significant naval component reduces operational flexibility at a regional level. Rebuilding that capability will require not only time and resources, but also an adjustment in how maritime risk is understood and managed going forward. Across all of this, one theme is becoming increasingly clear. Deterrence is no longer uniform. It is becoming segmented. In some environments, traditional superiority still holds. In others, it is heavily contested or partially neutralized by specific technologies designed for denial rather than control. This is why the recent engagement carries significance beyond its immediate tactical outcome. It reflects a transition in the nature of military competition itself. Instead of large-scale fleet-to-fleet confrontation, the decisive factor is increasingly the ability to prevent access before a force ever arrives in theater. That shift has long been discussed in military theory. What has changed is that it is now being demonstrated in practice under real conditions, with real consequences. The most important strategic uncertainty now is not whether these capabilities exist, they clearly do, but how quickly major powers adjust their operational assumptions in response. Institutions tend to adapt more slowly than events, especially when those events challenge long-standing frameworks of understanding. If adaptation occurs quickly, the system may stabilize into a new equilibrium where movement is more cautious but still functional. If adaptation is slow or incomplete, the risk is repeated crises as old assumptions collide with new realities. There is also a broader question of escalation control. When advanced denial systems are deployed across contested regions, even limited engagements carry higher risks of miscalculation. The compression of decision time, the speed of engagement, and the density of overlapping systems all reduce the margin for error. That does not make conflict inevitable, but it does make it more sensitive to timing, perception, and interpretation. Actions that might once have been routine now carry greater weight because the environment in which they occur has fundamentally changed. Ultimately, what this week reveals is not a single winner or loser, but a transition point. A moment where older models of naval dominance are no longer sufficient on their own, and newer models of distributed denial and asymmetric reach are beginning to define operational reality. Whether this leads to stabilization or further escalation depends entirely on how quickly the major actors adjust not just their deployments, but their assumptions about what those deployments can safely achieve. And that is the core issue moving forward. Not just capability, but belief. Belief in what is still possible, what is no longer safe, and what kind of risks states are willing to accept in a system that is no longer predictable in the way it once was.